Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline from Knitting House Square, and today I have another quick and easy knitting tutorial for you. So today is actually a requested video, and what I had a request for was a set of fingerless mittens where there is no extra thumb components. You don't have to pick up any stitches around this edge and keep on knitting. So this is the exact pattern I'm going to be showing you today. And what's nice about this one is that it's actually knit flat. So it makes it even more beginner friendly. So you can see we do have a seam up the side where the thumb hole is. And I'm going to be taking you through each one of the steps you need to create this project. So we're going to start with the cast on, then we're going to work ribbing. For the thumb portion, all we have to switch is to get that really nice clean edge along where the thumb is we're going to work some slip stitches along the edge, then go back just to our regular ribbing pattern, cast off at the top. So first we'll go through our materials, then we'll get started on the project. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down below. Also, the full written PDF version of this pattern will be linked on my website that's linked down below as well. So let's get started. The materials I have for this project are, first up, my yarn. So my yarn is a worsted weight or a medium weight. And so this one is from my local yarn shop, Loop, and it recommends a size US 8. So you want to look for something that recommends a similar size knitting needle. And so for these gloves or mittens, what we actually want to do is we want to use a slightly smaller knitting needle than what they recommend. That way the stitches end up a little bit tighter and they'll be a slightly bit warmer mitten. I'm just going to keep on calling it a mitten because that seems to be what I want to call it. So for my knitting needle now, I am knitting this flat. I don't have a lot of straight knitting needles, so instead I just knit flat on circular knitting needles. And these ones here are a size US 7, so one size smaller than the yarn recommends. The first thing I'm going to do is create a slip knot. So the way I do this is I unravel a bit of my yarn, and now I take this yarn tail, or the end of the yarn, and I lay it over my left hand. Once it's there, I grab onto that strand with my bottom 3 fingers, and I'm going to take this working yarn, or the yarn attached to the ball, I'm going to go back behind my finger down to the bottom, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom again, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom. Now I'm also going to grab onto that strand with my bottom 3 fingers. So it's essentially like I have 2.5 loops around my pointer finger. And to create the slip knot, I just rearrange these. So I'm going to take the middle loop and bring it up towards the top of my finger. Then I'm going to take the new middle loop, bring that one up towards the top of my finger. And I take that newest middle loop, grab onto it, and slide the strands off my finger. Now when I do that, I now have a slip knot. So with that slip knot, I like to take the yarn tail closest to me and make sure the working yarn's coming out furthest from me. And you just take any one of your knitting needle points and you go from right to left into that stitch, pull on the yarn tail gently to tighten it on there. Now you don't want it so tight it doesn't move, you still want it to be able to slide around that knitting needle. Now next up we're going to work our cast on. So to work the cast on, I hold my knitting needle in my right hand, and I like to hold on to that yarn tail too, just so I don't accidentally start casting on with it. And now again, I'm going to use a similar method to what I just did with the slip knot. So I'm going to take my left hand, go behind that strand of working yarn, grab onto it with my bottom 3 fingers, and I'm going to take my pointer finger, go down below that strand of working yarn, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my knitting needle, slide it under that topmost loop on my finger, slide the loop off my finger, and gently tighten it onto my knitting needle. Now again, I'm going to repeat that same movement. So I'm going to take my pointer finger, go back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, slide that topmost loop off of my finger onto my knitting needle. Go back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, slide the loop off my finger onto the knitting needle. So far I've cast on a total of 4 stitches, and the slip knot does count as one of the stitches. And in total, for the size I'm knitting, I'm going to cast on 38 stitches. Now, if you want to modify the size, just add or subtract in multiples of 2. Also, if you ever let go of your yarn, All you have to do to reset up is again take your left hand behind that strand of working yarn, grab onto it with your bottom 3 fingers, and again, start looping. So take your pointer finger down below, up the front to the top, then do it one more time, and now you can start casting on again. So I'm going to continue casting on until I have those 38 stitches on my knitting needle. Now that I have the 38 stitches on my knitting needle, I'm all ready to begin the ribbing rows. And this row we're just going to repeat over and over again all the way up until we get to the thumb hole up here. So this project is knit flat, as I mentioned. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn my knitting needle from when I cast on to be pointed the other direction. So now my point is going over towards the right. And I'm going to grab onto my other knitting needle. And this row, the way it's worked is you knit the first stitch, then you work a repeat of knit 1, purl 1 all the way across. So knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 until there's 1 stitch remaining, and then you purl the final stitch. So you'll notice in all of these rows, the first 2 stitches are knit stitches, the last 2 stitches are purl stitches. And that just makes it a little bit easier as we seam up the sides. So first, just a quick review of the knit stitch. So to work a knit stitch, I'm going to take my right knitting needle point into the base of the first stitch on my left knitting needle, and I'm going to go into the bottom of that stitch, going from left to right. So I'm going underneath it, starting at the left, coming out the back at the right. Now I take my working yarn, I go up in between the 2 knitting needles, pull it nice and snug, take my right knitting needle, pull that loop through, slide the stitch off my left knitting needle. Now the knit 1, purl 1 repeat begins. So again, I'm going to knit the next stitch. So I'm going to go into the base of that stitch, starting at the front, going from the left to the right, wrapping my yarn up in between the 2 knitting needles, pulling it tight, pulling that loop through, slide the stitch off. Now for a purl stitch, you need your working yarn to be in the front of your work. What that means is we need to take the working yarn in between the 2 knitting needles to the front before I actually purl. And now to purl the next stitch, I'm going to go into the front base of it, now going from right to left. Now I'm going to loop my yarn up, then down towards the left. And now I push that loop through and slide the stitch off of my left knitting needle. Now again, I have a knit stitch, so I need to bring my working yarn to the back. Go into the bottom base of it, from the left to the right, wrap my yarn around, pull through, purl stitch, bring my working yarn to the front, go into the base of the next stitch, push that loop through, slide it off. And I'm going to keep on working knit 1, purl 1 all the way across until 1 stitch remains. Now I'm at the point where I have 1 stitch remaining, and you can check to make sure you did everything correctly across the row because you should have just finished with a purl stitch. And now we're going to purl the final stitch as well. So we started with a knit 2, we ended with a purl 2. Now to work the next row, I'm going to turn my work so the knitting needle point is going over towards the right, and I'm going to work that exact same row again. So first step, make sure you aren't knitting with your tail because I make that mistake a lot. So working yarn, again, knit the first stitch, then work knit 1, purl 1 all the way across. And I'm going to continue repeating this row over and over again until my work measures 3.5 inches. So I'm going to measure from the bottom of the cast on to the bottom of the knitting needle. And when that measures 3.5 inches, I'm all ready to put in where my thumb is going to go. So next up, I'm going to place where my thumb is going to go. And to do that, since it's knit flat, all I'm going to do is I'm going to begin slipping one stitch along the edge. So what I mean by that is when I begin a row, I'm just going to take my right knitting needle into the base of the next stitch, going purlwise from right to left, pass it off onto my right knitting needle, so I never actually worked it. And now I'm just going to begin working in pattern across the rest of the row. So now I have knit one, then my next stitch I have the purl bump. So I'm going to purl one, knit one, purl one, all the way across until that last stitch remains, which I'm going to purl. Purling that final stitch. So in that row, all I did differently than the rows previously is I slipped that first stitch. So now when I turn my work, again, I'm going to do that exact same thing. So I'm going to slip my first stitch purlwise, so I'm not actually working it. Then I'm going to work in pattern across the rest of the row. So where I usually would have knit the first two stitches, I slipped the first one. Now I'm knitting the second stitch, bring my yarn to the front, and working across. Purl one, knit one, continuing across, and again, purling the last stitch. And I'm going to continue working these rows where I slip the first stitch purlwise until, looking at one side of my work, all of those slip stitches along the edge measures 1.5 inches. So I'll show you when I come back what it looks like and how you can differentiate between the slip stitches and the non-slip stitches, so you can tell how far you should measure. The key here is that the slip stitches will end up being a little bit longer than the regular stitches along that edge. So when you're measuring, looking along that side edge, what you're looking for the slip stitches is you want to look for the large loops. So you can see how down here at the bottom, each one of them is pretty tight, and then up here at the top, they become a lot larger. So you're looking for up here at the top, and then I ended up doing a total of 5 slip stitches along either edge, and that gave me 1.5 inches. So now that I've completed those slip stitches, I'm going to go back to just working the regular knit and purl rounds. So I'm going to knit my first stitch, then work knit one, purl one, all the way across, purl the final stitch, and I'm going to continue working that row over and over again for 1.5 inches. Then I'll come back and I'll show you the cast off. And I also wanted to mention real quick why we don't just slip the stitches all the way up the edge. The reason for that is it's actually more difficult to seam when you have slip stitches. So anywhere we have to seam, so this whole bottom portion and then the 2 inches at the top, where we do seam the two sides together, in all of those regions, we aren't going to be slipping that first stitch to make it easier to sew. Now the last step up here at the top is to cast off these stitches before we can seam up the side. So the way I cast off is first I'm going to knit into the first stitch, and then I'm going to knit the second stitch as well. So once I have 2 stitches over here on my right hand knitting needle, I'm going to take the previous stitch and slide it up over and off the second stitch that's on my left knitting needle, or right knitting needle. So to do this, I'm going to use my left knitting needle, and I'm going to go into the base of that one that's closest to my hand. So the first one I knit, and it typically helps if you pull onto the working yarn a little bit so you don't lose the other stitch. Slide it up, over, and off. Now I'm going to knit a new stitch from my left hand knitting needle, and now I'm going to repeat that exact same step again. So I'm going to take the previous stitch, use my left knitting needle to slide it up, over, and off the newer stitch. I'm going to keep on doing this all the way across the top edge. And as I'm doing it, I want to make sure I don't pull any of the stitches too tight, because you do want to keep in mind that these stitches need to be a little bit loose across the top edge, because it's where your fingers are going to go. So you want to make sure you still have a little bit of stretch up there at the top. So I'm going to keep on going all the way across this top edge. Now I just have the 1 stitch remaining on my right hand knitting needle. So I'm going to cut my yarn, and here I do leave a little bit of a longer tail, so probably right about 18 inches here. And the reason for that is I like to use this yarn tail to seam as well. So I'm going to cut that yarn tail, and now using my right knitting needle, I just pull that stitch a little bit larger, and I'm going to thread that tail through the remaining stitch, and then just lightly tighten it. Now that we finished knitting the whole portion, we're going to fold it in half and get to seaming. The last step here is going to be the seaming. So the way it's going to work is you can use either side down towards the table, and we're going to fold in the two edges and seam up them as we go up, leaving where that thumb opening is with those slip stitches open. So what I like to do if I have enough yarn is use these yarn tails to seam with. So along the top, I left myself a long enough yarn tail to be able to sew just that 1.5 inches up there. But down here at the bottom, I didn't quite leave myself enough yarn. So I'm going to take a new piece of yarn and join it. I always like to have extra, so it's probably about 24 inches. I'm going to thread my tapestry needle with that yarn. When I folded my edges here, I'm going to show you exactly what we're looking for on either side as we're picking up one bar. So starting over here on the left, this is where we had the 2 knit stitches at the beginning of the round. So it tends to like to curl. So what you're looking for is the full set of V's before the purl stitch. So you can kind of see how there's an edge stitch here, then there's a full set of V's going all the way up, and then if you stretch it out a bit, you'll see your purls kind of hidden in between the columns of knit stitches. So you want to take your fingernail and then go right to the other side of those V's and stretch out your work a little bit. And when you do that, you're going to see these little bars. So these bars are what you want to pick up on the knit side. And then over here on the purl side, again, stretch out your work. And here what I like to pick up is kind of going over from right to left from that column of knit stitches, all those V's, is you have a down bar, an up bar, and then a down bar. You want to pick up the second most down bar. So there's the down, up, down. You want to pick up the down. Then again, right above that, there's the down, up, down. You want to pick up the down one. So we're going to go back and forth from one side to the other, picking up one of those bars from either side. So I'm going to start over here on the purl side. I'm going to go all the way, kind of one stitch in from the edge, and I'm going to pick up my first bar there. I'm going to leave a yarn tail here so I don't pull it all the way through. Now I'm going to fold in the other side, and again, I want to go right in between those V's and that edge stitch, stretch out my work, and now I'm going to pick up that first bar. Now I don't tighten it very much at the beginning either. I'm just going to leave it pretty loose. Go back over here to the other side, pick up the next row up. Back over to here, the other side, stretch it out, pick up the next bar. I'm going to keep on going back and forth like this for about 1 inch or so. Now, once I've gone for 1 inch, I'm going to hold on to that piece of yarn I joined down here at the bottom, and then I'm going to lightly pull on the piece of yarn I was just sewing with, and it's going to close up that seam. So now it essentially looks just like the other sets of knits and purls where it's really hidden along there. So now again, what I do is I begin going for about 1 inch, and then I'm going to pull on my yarn again to tighten those stitches up. And I'm going to keep on going all the way up until I get to where I slip those stitches for the thumb. And again, those are going to be where the opening is a lot larger up here at the top. So down here at the bottom where it's like a lot of stitches close together, those aren't the slip stitches. In the center portion here, those are our slip stitches. Once I get to where the thumb opening is, I'm going to turn my glove around the other side, take that yarn off my tapestry needle, and now I'm going to thread it with my cast off edge, or if your cast off tail isn't long enough, you can always add another piece of yarn again. And now here, I'm going to go back and forth. Now since I turned it upside down, now the purl stitches are over here on the left, the knit stitches are over here on the right, but I'm just going to follow that exact same process. So I'm going to stretch out my work, find the first set of V's, then over here on the other side, find that same bar I was picking up before. Okay, so now I finished going all the way in until where the thumb starts or ends. And now I'm all finished with the seaming portion. You can tighten this one up a little bit too, if you need to. So that seems good. Last thing I have to do is I have to weave in all my ends. Now before I weave in these two for the thumb, I always like to try it on and just make sure I like how large that opening is. So for me, this works out perfectly. If you need to, you can always unwind a few of those stitches you just finished with. So to weave in the ends, I'm going to take all of my tails to the inside of my work, which is going to be where that seamed edge is. That's my seam. And now with these, the easiest place to weave it in usually is to this actual seam itself. So for instance, if I take one of these tails down here at the bottom where my cast on was, what I can do is I can take this yarn tail and just go back and forth into this big bump that's created from seaming. And I just go up for about an inch or so. Another way that you can do it is you can take one of the stitches along these columns and just kind of wrap the yarn around your knitting needle as you go up the column. Then pull that tail through. And then when you're all done, just cut that yarn. Then keep on going with the next set. For these two around the thumb, I also do like to tie small knots as well, so that I make sure they don't come open anyhow. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this quick and easy fingerless mittens tutorial. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button. That way you stay up to date on all my future videos. I'll see you next time.